Thanks for coming today. My name is Micah Uetricht. A couple people in the crowd here. I was a student of Megan Burke, so they probably know at Loyola. It would have been like 4 years ago.
I think so.
I am a writer in Chicago, I guess, soon to be full-time writer, mostly on labor issues, and I've sort of stumbled into writing about labor and education issues and teachers unions in general. And I'm not, I say that to emphasize that I'm not a teacher, right? I don't know, I have no clue what it's like to be in front of a classroom full of children every day for 7 hours, and so I feel like it's funny because I don't really feel like much of an expert on that kind of thing. There's probably people around the circle who have much more of an expertise in that than I do. But I am interested, particularly in teachers unionism and education reform, because obviously, especially folks who are going to be teachers soon know that education reform is a big thing that is talked about. There's sort of a battle over what that education reform will look like, and who are the people who are pushing that education reform, and, which I'll get into in a second. But I say all this to say that I am not any kind of expert on education, and I'm certainly not neutral on anything like this. I'm the son of a teachers union member of my mom is a member of the National Education Association in Michigan. She's a paraprofessional. That's one of the NEA is one of the two national teachers unions, American Federation of Teachers and the NEA. I worked in labor since I was an undergrad, first in a group called United Students Against Sweatshops, and then I've worked for different unions and labor organizations since I graduated. So I put my bias up front. I am a partisan for the labor movement, for unions. I think they're really important, which I'll get into in the talk. But I just say that to just sort of get that out there. That I'm no neutral observer of this stuff. So education is of interest to me, again, as an outsider, for several reasons, and I think the principal one is that I think the education system, particularly in an urban area like Chicago where I live, is a place where a lot of the different forms of inequality on class or on gender or on race all sort of come together in stark contrast here. You see racial inequality very vividly in Chicago school system, class inequality. Among teachers, you see a lot of the issues around gender and work, and sort of devaluing of what is always traditionally been in the U.S. women's work, right? The teaching. You see all of this sort of come together under one building, under a school, and children are the ones who it's played out like, not adults. So children are the vehicle through which you see these inequalities. So that's the main reason why it's something that's so important for me to examine, because you see a lot of these larger issues in society all coming together under one roof. And you also see that all those things coming together in what has come to be known as education reform, which over the last decade and a half or so has been something that lots of folks have been sort of beating the drum about the need to reform American public schools, in particular urban public schools in America. Before I even get into what the specifics of that are, I think education reform is usually talked about as if it's its own sort of independent phenomenon, something that isn't connected at all to larger shifts in the economy, larger changes in the relationship between bosses and workers, large changes about what's happening in the public sector. It's usually framed as there is a crisis in America on public education. We have to do something about it, without sort of acknowledging that the kinds of fixes that have been proposed for education reform are the same kind of fixes that we've seen in large part proposed for the American workforce as a whole. And so, the name for that kind of ideological thought around what changes in the broader economy should look like, is neoliberalism, or the ascendance of hyper free market, hyper capitalism that has been seen at least since Ronald Reagan in the 80s, not before that. And as I said, the ideas that have come to dominate education reform are very similar to those ideas that that are part of the sort of neoliberal consensus as a whole. So the neoliberal era, sort of this era of the extreme of free market capitalism, started in earnest in the early 1980s, led by people like Ronald Reagan, Margaret Thatcher in the UK, who just died last week, among other world leaders. And it's a sort of a word that it feels sort of neoliberalism. What does that really mean? Liberalism, is it related to like the left wing? Like, what does it really mean? So I have a definition here from somebody, academic David Harvey, who wrote a book that's a brief history of neoliberalism. It's the theory of economic practices that proposes that human well-being can best be advanced by liberating individual entrepreneurial freedoms and skills within an institutional framework characterized by strong private property rights, free markets, and free trade. And the role of the state is to create and preserve an institutional framework appropriate to such practices. So in sort of less jargon, it means that neoliberalism sees the free market as the best way to make life better for all people, right? So if more free market means better lives for more people, what we need is to expand the market more and more into everybody's lives. And then the role of government, is in the second part of that quote, under neoliberalism, is to push that expansion of the free market, to help facilitate it, its expansion into areas perhaps where the market wasn't always present in the past. So what that means, sort of in less theoretical terms, is since the 1980s, there's been an effort to try to destroy unions in the U.S. Membership in unions in this country has been on a sort of steady decline since the 1970s, to the point where we now have, I think the total number is there's less than 7% of American workers who are in the private sector who are in unions. I think it's a little less than 12% overall who are both public and private sector employees who are in unions. And it's just a number that's sort of steadily declining. Every year we hear the new numbers about how labor movement has lost more and more members. We're at the lowest amount of people now since the Great Depression in unions. And there's an attack on unions because unions are the principal body through which workers can defend their rights in society. Workers who have unions across the board have, their health care, their pay, processes for being fired. They can't just be at the whim of the boss if the boss doesn't like your color of your shirt one day, or wants to discriminate against you because you're, for any reason, a woman or whatever. There are sort of fixed processes by which you are protected as a worker that you don't have in this country if you don't have a union. And that is obviously a big impediment to corporations, companies being able to make money because they don't want to pay people more money. They don't want to give people better health care benefits. They want to have total control over a workplace in order to shape it to whatever can make them the most money. Right? That's how the free market works. And so we've lost all these union members since the 1980s. That there's been huge expansion of inequality in the U.S., which is also at the worst level it's been since the Great Depression. Folks probably heard a lot about that around 2011 when the Occupy movement was happening, talking about the 1% getting huge amounts of the benefits of the economy hugely expanding inequality under the 1%. 1% gets more and more, 1% richest people in the country have more and more wealth, while the vast majority of the country suffers. And it's been the same story in countries all over the world who have instituted these same kinds of policies. I don't know if anyone saw during Margaret Thatcher's funeral in the UK, which was, I think, 2 days ago or yesterday. I mean, there were people who were gathered to mourn, but there were also thousands of people who were out in the streets, like booing the casket as it went by, and having parties in the streets because of Margaret Thatcher's death. That's because, in large part, a lot of people's lives in the UK were greatly worsened under the neoliberal era, and it's the same in country after country. The other thing that's happened under the neoliberal era is that since workers don't have unions and don't have a way to sort of have a body that can fight for their rights on the job and what their conditions on the job are going to be like, that bosses force them to do more and more work for maybe at a faster pace or extra responsibilities for the same or even less pay than they've had in the past. One of the main things that's meant that's relevant to this discussion is this privatization, the selling off of two corporations of public goods. So does anyone, I know we're not in Chicago, but did folks in Bloomington hear about the parking meter deal that happened in Chicago recently? A few years ago, I guess it is. That the city used to, it sounds like an inane example, but I think it's actually a really good one because, the city used to run all the parking meters in Chicago, and so when you put in your quarters for the parking meter, that quarter would then go back to the city to, build a road or purify your water or pay for the, an annual free Jay-Z concert, at the whatever the city does, the city takes that money and provides goods to its services, whether essential things like water purification or things like Jay-Z. But the city privatized the parking meters, which turned it over to a for-profit corporation. So the rates immediately shot up, and now when you pay $7 an hour to park in downtown Chicago, you're not paying for the Jay-Z concert anymore. You're paying for some of the CEOs and executives' pockets to get fatter. So that's one example. There's many things in Chicago and other cities privatized, sold off, that were overseen by the government, but were given over to the private sector. Also, the chipping away of government services, like everything from erosion of food stamps, services given to citizens like food stamps or welfare, or things like the postal service, or police officers and firefighters. Those are things that are paid for by the public sector, by the government. And as budgets have gotten tighter, there's been a large push for less services from people like police officers and firefighter, or the current fight is no Saturday service for the American U.S. Postal Service, things like that. So these are the a couple of the broad trends that are in the American economy today in the 21st century. And I list all of those things out because, again, those kinds of changes that have been happening in the American economy are in large part a lot of the same things that have been seen in education reform during the late 90s and 2000s up to now. And so we usually assume that the decisions that are made about what education reform looks like, well, it's because somebody thinks that children are, American public school children are getting the short end of the stick, and we need to change the system in order to ensure that they can have a better future, a better education. When really, a lot of these changes that are suggested are sort of in the same vein as these other things that have worked to expand inequality and to erode services for people who need them, and stuff like that. So I think it's important. It's important to sort of keep those broad changes in mind whenever there's this discussion about what American education reform looks like. So, in terms of specifically education reform, during the neoliberal free market reform era, much like the whole list of things I just gave about changes in the broader economy, in education we've seen maybe first and foremost an attack on teachers' unions. The teachers' unions are to blame for all of the ills of public education in America. Has anyone ever seen the movie Waiting for Superman, the big documentary that came out a few years ago? Whenever the head of the American Federation of Teachers, President Randy Weingarten, comes on in that movie, it's like, it's like this evil music like starts around her because she is the one who is holding back America's school children from learning. That's the idea. That the teachers' unions defend the interests of themselves and themselves only, and don't really care what happened to public school children. That's the idea. And so that's been why there have been such strong attacks on teachers' unions in 2000. There's this idea that poverty of students doesn't matter, that it shouldn't matter in terms of how they are taught. Teachers' unions have, over the years, frequently talked about the poverty of students as to why their public schools are in such sad shape in urban areas. Well, a lot of it has to do with the poverty of the students. If you listen to people like Michelle Rhee, who's a big education reformer, talk, or anybody in this Waiting for Superman movie, or the head of Teach for America, Wendy Kopp, when inequality is brought up, poverty is brought up with students, the response is always, poverty doesn't matter. What matters is whether or not the teacher in front of the classroom is willing to work hard enough to teach these children, and whatever conditions are happening outside of the classroom don't matter. And so, that kind of statement, they wouldn't say this outright, but clearly education reform is seen as something that happens independently of any other kinds of changes, like fighting for better wages for public school children's parents, for example, or ensuring that we have a public healthcare system in this country, so poor urban public school students can make sure that they go, get their illnesses taken care of if their parents don't have enough money to afford health insurance. Those things are always sort of left aside. All that matters is the teacher's willingness to just work really, really hard and make up for whatever problems the student has outside of the class. Things like class size don't matter, that you can have a class full of 45 elementary school students. If you have a good teacher there, they can deal with it, and they'll be able to deliver. The future teachers of Chicago are shaking their heads at this over here, but that's the idea. That they'll say that explicitly. So class size doesn't matter, which is sort of kind of like the push for what American workers as a whole are expected to do, right? That they're expected to produce more, and that they just need to sort of put their head down and do it. And in the case of education, we should be able to throw as many students as you as possible, and you should be able to handle it if you're a good teacher, if you're a teacher who deserves to actually be in a classroom. That education should not be overseen by the public anymore, that it should not be a public good, that private corporations should be the ones that are running public education, or that should be running, I guess, education as a whole. That they can do a better job of educating children than the government can. So, private companies who, if you're a private company, again, your goal is to make money, and you have to sort of answer to the bottom line eventually. The idea is that is a better business model, free market model is a way that will better serve America's school children than not having the profit motive present. There's the idea that teaching doesn't need to be sort of professionalized, that if you read a lot of accounts, sort of sympathetic accounts of education reform, you hear people saying that, a waste of time that people go to school to study education. You know, the Teach for America model, for example, is that you have a couple of weeks of learning the basics of how to teach kids, and then you just throw them in front of a classroom. But Teach for America, you know, takes a lot of sort of Ivy League level people who come from very elite backgrounds. And so the idea is that you need these people who are the best and the brightest. If you pick the very smartest people from the most elite schools to go teach, they'll be able to handle anything you throw at them, ostensibly because they are the smartest, the elite cream of the crop in society, right? And then after they do the 2 years of Teach for America, they can then go on to law school or work on Wall Street or whatever it is, which is how that program has become to be seen by a lot of people. People from elite schools go there, and it looks great on their resume for when they apply to law school or whatever. So for Teach for America specifically, it's like teaching becomes this sort of 2-year thing that you do to sort of give back to some kids, and then you just, rather than teaching being a career that people are dedicated to for their entire lives. There's the obsession with standardized testing, right? Probably folks have heard a lot about this lately, that if you are going to, you know, in the free market, for example, private companies, that, you know, managers and CEOs are constantly looking at a stream of data to analyze what kind of output they're getting from their workers, right? And so there's a similar idea with students, that if you test and test and test students with standardized tests, you can find out whether or not the teachers have been doing a good job teaching these students. And that one of the things that's most sort of jarring to me is that democracy is an actual barrier to instituting this kind of reform. In Chicago, for example, the school board and the CEO of Chicago Public Schools are not elected by the citizens of Chicago. They are appointed by the mayor. The same thing is true in New York City. I believe the mayor of Los Angeles is pushing for it there. And folks will say very explicitly, if you have these democratic measures in the school system, if people are allowed to vote for who's going to be on the school board or whatever, we're not going to be able to accomplish the kind of reforms that we need to accomplish. So there's this kind of open hatred and distrust of democracy that to me is a very jarring thing in a country that supposedly prides itself on being highly democratic. And so the people who push these reforms are the same people who have benefited from the larger neoliberal shift in American society. I mean, school reform has become this kind of pet cause for a lot of really, really wealthy people. The three foundations that are pushing it the strongest in the U.S. are the Broad Foundation, which is Broad. Eli Broad was he headed up a mortgage company that he eventually became a billionaire, and he founded this foundation that became one of the most important foundations in pushing school reform. The Gates Foundation, Bill and Melinda Gates, by far the biggest foundation that will put money towards these kinds of things, so making these kinds of reforms happen. And the Walton Foundation, which is owned by the Walton family of the Walmart fame. Right? So these are people who have become extremely wealthy during the neoliberal era, but we're sort of supposed to think that now that they've made their money, they want to give back by sort of giving it all to the children. It's all for the children. But you see them sort of trying to remake the public education system in the much like they would run their own company, right? To make money and to sort of get lots of output from it, quantifiable output. And then folks on Wall Street, hedge fund managers, and other millionaire and billionaire folks on Wall Street have sort of made it into this charity of choice. There's this quote from this book, Class Warfare, that's about came out 2 years ago. That's about sort of education reform fights generally, and it's about this organization, Democrats for Education Reform, which is trying to push the Democratic Party to accept and get behind more of these kinds of reforms. And the quote says that the deeper Democrats for Education Reform plan for the millions in donations that they've received from other millionaires and billionaires was right out of the playbook of former George W. Bush political guru Karl Rove and other conservative political activists. They were going to put the millions into a type of political action fund called 501c4 that did not have to reveal its donors. That way, the unions couldn't attack their campaign as a plot by Wall Street billionaires to take over the public schools. So there's a sort of very open admittance that people who are extremely wealthy are trying to hide the fact that they are the ones who are pushing education reform because they know people knew where the money was coming from that was pushing for these kinds of reforms. They might be a little suspect of the motives of people that were pushing. So that's sort of a lot of the background of it. In terms of what those reforms have looked like around the U.S., you can look at around the U.S. Chicago is actually a good example because Chicago is one of the primary cities where these reforms have been instituted. You can see that it has not produced great results for Chicago's school children and for school children around the country. One of the, to take Chicago as an example, charter schools have been a particularly, one of the biggest ways that they've pushed these kinds of education reform in Chicago. Because charter schools are schools that, get money from the public. Almost, I think the number is like 98 or 99% of the funding comes from the public, from the government, in the same way that a traditional public school would run. But they don't have to obey a lot of the rules that a traditional public school has to obey. And that one of those rules they don't have to obey, for example, is that teachers don't have to be in union in charter schools. And Chicago has 110 charter schools. The Gates Foundation has this, Chicago signed on this plan with the Gates Foundation that would open up 60 new charter schools in Chicago by 2017. And those schools will be opening at the same time that CPS is closing on some schools, which maybe folks have heard about, which I'll talk more about in a second. But in terms of how students in those schools have performed, you can look at, charter schools do a lot of standardized testing, right? So even if you don't think that standardized testing is the best way to gauge how well students are doing, you can look at there are lots of studies that look at what kind of standardized test scores students from charter schools have produced, right? And there's lots of competing studies that argue that the numbers, argue about what the performance of students in charter schools look like. That's part of the result of having people like billionaires in your corners that you can fund your own studies to examine whether or not your reforms have been successful. And lo and behold, the study that you paid for found that your school is doing great, right? There's the largest study that's been done on charter school performance came out of Stanford University's education school, and it found that overall around the country, charter schools aren't outperforming traditional public schools nationally. The U.S. Department of Education released a study in 2010 that found the same thing among middle schools. There was another study that the Department of Education did every year from 2003, 2005, 2007, 2009, found the same thing every year. So even on the metric that charter schools claim to care about the most, right, these standardized test scores, and they spend lots of time teaching students to be able to perform well on standardized tests, they don't outperform most traditional. Teachers union membership nationally is way down, especially in Chicago, because there are all of these charter schools opening up at the same time that traditional public schools are closing. One thing that I read about recently is that when a charter school opens up in a neighborhood, like if a neighborhood school closes and the charter school takes its place, the student body that then comes back to that charter school looks much different than the student body that was there in the traditional public school. Students, because charter schools get to choose, right, who is in their classroom, right? They can, rather than just taking any student who lives in the neighborhood, like most neighborhood public schools do, they can turn people down. And so, in Chicago, for example, charter schools. The numbers are that 15.8% of students in all of CPS as a whole are English as a second language learners, but only 8% in charter schools are English as a second language learners. There's sort of similar numbers in terms of like special ed students. CPS has a large percentage or a decent percentage of special ed students. Far fewer special ed students in charter schools in Chicago. And it's because charter schools can look at these students and say, well, you know, so from a business point of view, right, from a private corporations type of view, they say, well, I have this special ed student in my classroom. I'm going to have to invest lots of resources into them. They're going to require a smaller class size, or to require all kinds of resources that the other students wouldn't require. So maybe I should accept them into my school. I heard a story from a special ed teacher in Chicago last week. Had a student who, her school closed, she tried to get them into another charter school that was in the neighborhood, and when she called them up, they said, oh yeah, we got plenty of space, but then once she actually put in the application, they had to write in the application that the student was a special ed student with pretty severe special ed needs. And all of a sudden, oh, actually we don't have any room in the school right now. And so that's a common story that I've heard from multiple teachers who are dealing with special ed students. The numbers show that too, that the charter schools don't accept those kinds of students with special needs in the same way. In Chicago, there's this idea, you know, charter schools have opened up, especially in low-income areas, and sort of when they open up, they have a lot of money and can pull students from the traditional public school and try to get them to come to this charter school. So they'll, you know, go door to door knocking about how great this charter school is. You should send your student, your child here, and can sort of suck students from the traditional neighborhood public schools. And then several years later, the school is underutilized. There are not enough students occupying the classrooms at that school, and so we need to close the school, which is a big fight that's happening in Chicago right now. Well, part of the reason that a lot of these schools are underutilized is because charter schools are taking the students from the traditional public school and encouraging them to come to the charter school. And so in general, there's been you know, class size expansion, and this idea that I think is maybe the key thing is the expansion of the sort of mindset of the private sector into public schools. That there are people who are now making lots of money based on this push for privatization. So, you know, standardized testing, for example. There are schools. There are corporations who run, you know, administer standardized tests and have people to grade them also. So they are getting, you know, huge amounts of money in contracts with schools who are obsessed with standardized testing. I think half of charter operators around the country are for-profit. So these are operators who get money from the government, the same amount of money that you would get. Often the same amount of money that you would get per student that a public school would get per student, right? But they're actually for-profit corporations whose goal is to make profit. And even in the non-profits, there's sort of the charters seem to lend themselves to an idea of corruption happening. I mean, in Chicago, there's this major charter operator, UNO. It's one of the most powerful, politically powerful charter networks in the city, and there was just this huge story about there's this sort of old school Chicago-style patronage, sort of handing out, you know, contracts to the CEO's brother or his uncle or his wife's friend, you know, millions of dollars. It's all coming from taxpayers' pockets that is given out in sort of old school corruption. So. And there's, you know, other stuff I mentioned before. It's sort of lack of democracy, all that kind of stuff is happening in Chicago, which, as I said, is one of the most, you know, one of the central places in the country where you see this model sort of being tested out. Right? So we've got less democracy. Teachers are making less money. I think teachers in Chicago make $20,000 on average less at a charter school than they do at a traditional public school, according to CPS's numbers. 70,000 is the median salary for 70,000 is the salary for a traditional public school teacher. It's like 50-some thousand for a charter teacher. You know, so that's the kind of thing that you see in Chicago, the expansion of this model. And overall, there's this idea, and this is sort of where the discussion about the Chicago teacher union comes in. There's this idea, there's this loss in the idea of what public education is actually supposed to be all about. You know, the supposed idea behind public education is it's supposed to be this kind of equalizer for all people, right? That you're supposed to be dedicated to educating all students, no matter what their needs are, or what their race is, or what their their class background. Like, and of course that hasn't played out in practice. We do have these massive inequalities, but that's supposedly the idea that is undergirding the entire public education system. But you have charter schools, some of which are, obeying the profit motive, think that it's okay to dump kids that they don't think that will make it, or that will require an extra investment of resources. Kids with behavior problems, or kids who speak English as a second language, all that stuff. So, there's a shift in the idea of what even undergirds public education, that we're losing this idea that it's supposed to be something for everyone, that all students are supposed to be able to enjoy the same opportunities. And so, these are some of the things that become sort of the mainstream consensus in education reform. It's been sort of endorsed wholeheartedly by both parties. I mean, I talked about the Democrats for Education Reform, this group that's trying to push the Democratic Party to accept lots of these kinds of reforms. Obviously in Chicago, Rahm Emanuel is a Democrat. He's one of the principal people who is pushing this kind of agenda. President Obama has been on board with this kind of stuff since before he was even a senator. He's always pushed for these kinds of education reforms. You can see it in his Race to the Top program, which is based on a lot of these assumptions about education. It's also based on a similar program that was done in Chicago, Renaissance 2010. So the Democratic Party as a whole really buys into this idea that this is the kind of reform that we need in education. And so this is a really highly damaging agenda for teachers, for students, and for all communities, especially in urban areas. And then it's one that should be fought, in my opinion. But the question is, how should it be fought? Well, the one group that really is big enough to take on agenda, to take up this agenda on, to really push back against this kind of reform, are teachers unions. Teachers unions are the only people who have the resources, who have the sort of organizational capacity, who have the mass membership, the sort of discipline as an organization, to really be able to push back on this kind of stuff. Which is why, of course, education reformers want to get rid of them, is because they know this, that they know that teachers unions have the potential to be this kind of body that can push back against this kind of reform. Just like in the larger economy, unions are the way that workers can really fight for their rights on the job, fight against the agenda of their bosses. Teachers unions are the way that can be done in education, and so they need to be destroyed, or at least weakened and brought on board to that agenda of supporting this kind of education. And in Chicago, the Chicago Teachers Union was one of the earliest, city where there was teachers who got together to organize around their conditions at work and to eventually form a union. There were a bunch of unions. There used to be separate unions in Chicago. They all formed the CTU, I think, in the 30s. And they were fighting against issues like extremely low pay. There was this really sexist ideas about, well, if a woman is working, then it must be just supplemental income to her husband, who is the one who's actually making the money for the family, so we don't even pay them very much. Total lack of control over what reform in the schools would look like. Reform has always been something ever since the early 1900s. People are beating the drum of education reform, and the teachers are usually not the ones who, despite being the ones who are in the classroom every day, who are, live the education system firsthand. They're not the ones who are turned to what those reforms should look like, right? And so, in the 30s, there's a very fascinating history of the Chicago Teachers Union. If you all are going to teach in Chicago, it might be interesting to read about. In the 30s, for example, teachers hadn't been paid during the Great Depression for months on end. They were way behind in receiving their paychecks, and there were teachers within the union who were sort of agitating, trying to get their union to do something about it. The union wouldn't do much about it. And so the independently organized groups of teachers, there was one, the real famous one is led by this guy John Fuchs, who became president of the union later. But he was a phys ed teacher, a high school phys ed teacher. He led groups of teachers in this mass rally in downtown Chicago where they were attacked by police on horses, and they had brought textbooks that they threw at the police on these horses. And these really crazy, you wouldn't think about public school teachers throwing textbooks at police on horses, but this is the sort of tradition in places like Chicago and other urban areas that a really pitched battle on the streets around teachers' issues. They eventually were paid after leading these kind of similar fights for a long time. In the 60s and 70s in Chicago, the civil rights movement focused a lot around education and how unequal the schools were, and the teachers' union was not on board with a lot of those kinds of reforms, and so there were, again, independent groups within the union who were trying to push the union to take on racial justice as a topic. In Chicago in the 60s and 70s, there was this thing called full-time basis substitutes, which, despite the fact that there was this growing population of African-American students in the school system, African-American teachers were locked into the system of being a full-time basis substitute and couldn't ever make it to being a full teacher, and the sort of pay and honor and all that goes along with that. And so there had to be independent efforts within the union to make the union care about those things, and as well as get on board with what was happening with the broader civil rights movement at the time. And that actually, those fights, those racial justice fights in the union, led to, in the 70s, the creation of what was called the United Progressive Caucus. Good sort of democratic open unions have ways to sort of duke it out within their membership, duke it out in sort of positive sort of democratic sense of running different slates of candidates to for leadership in the union. Membership votes on them, right? Sort of like many political parties within unions themselves. And this caucus, the United Progressive Caucus, which came out of these racial justice fights, was formed in the 1970s. And sort of the short history is that they started as a really progressive leadership that was fighting for racial justice issues, but by the time that the 2000s, 90s and 2000s rolled around, they had become, I think, what a lot of people want you to think of unions, sort of very top-heavy, people at the top paying themselves lots of money, not really fighting for their members, sort of not doing much for their membership despite whatever attacks are happening on their members. In the 2000s, there were all kinds of school closings that were starting to happen in Chicago, again around closing public schools and opening up charter schools in their wake, and the union leadership wasn't doing anything around it. So the union, some people in the union who were very angry about the fact that they were losing their jobs and that the union wasn't doing much about it, started this caucus, the Caucus of Rank and File Educators, to eventually, at first it was just sort of try to push the union to act, and it eventually turned into a slate of people that ran for the leadership of the union to take control. And And one teacher, when I was interviewing him, told me that the way he would characterize the old leadership during the 2000s, they would say that you're tempted to say that they were asleep at the wheel, of the wheel being the union, but they actually weren't asleep. They were joyriding. That they were, despite the fact that there were all kinds of attacks on the union, the schools were closing, all this stuff was happening, they were paying themselves massive amounts of money and not really doing anything for their membership. So this group core started organizing, and because the union has this sort of vibrant democratic tradition, they led a traditional campaign in their union and won in 2010. And so I tell this story because I think a lot of people, even people who are sympathetic to the union, see the Chicago Teachers Union and think, oh wow, that's crazy what they're doing there in Chicago. I wish, for example, my mom, who's a teachers union, would say, I wish my union was like that, without realizing that it was actually just a group of teachers who were in the classroom for decades, who just became very angry with what their union was doing or was not doing. And decided to run the slate and take over the union. And I think it's important to tell that history because a lot of people think of unions as unions in general, teachers unions in particular, as being one way, right? Without realizing that there's a contestation within unions about what that union is going to look like. That there is, a lot of people describe it as business unionism versus social movement unionism. There are people that there's a way of doing labor movement, sort of business as usual, where you sort of don't you don't want to push too many people's buttons, you don't want to rock the boat, you just sort of can pay yourself lots of money and just not really do much to fight for what people, what your members' needs are. And which certainly wouldn't make any kind of ties to broader communities, to fight for something beyond just like pay and benefits, right? The main focus of the union is to fight for better pay and benefits for the members, versus this kind of social movement unionism, which is what you now see in the Chicago Teachers Union, where the union is about far more than just good benefits and better pay, but it's about a larger agenda of social justice. It's about fighting racism and racial inequalities in Chicago public schools. It's about maintaining education as a public good, that not handed over to private corporations to do with as they please. So I think it's important to remember that when folks sort of speak about unions as being one way, that there are multiple ways of doing unionism, and in Chicago you can see the sort of fight within a union for what that union is going to look like. So once the union took over in 2010, lots of things changed very quickly. There was membership involvement in a way that had never been done before. And previously it was just sort of the leadership that was in charge of things, and then maybe, I remember people would tell me when I interviewed them that they didn't know who the president was. They couldn't remember their name. They just knew that once in a while they had to check in to see, what their, if they'd be getting a raise for the next contract or something like that. But certainly the union was not seen as the way by which they were going to really fight, or even something they had to be very involved with. They just sort of paid their dues to the union once a month, and that was the extent of their involvement. So this core comes in and really engages new levels of the membership, gets people involved in all kinds of different things. They have the summer internship program where the union goes out and is knocking on people's doors, people who are parents of Chicago public school students, and asking them sort of what they want education, what they want the children's education to look like. A real engagement with organized groups and communities in these neighborhoods, especially where there are things like school closings happening. So majority African American and Latino neighborhoods where community groups have been fighting this kind of education reform for a long time. They've been fighting school closures and all that stuff. The union, with this new leadership, becomes a close partner with these community groups. So again, expanding what their concern is as a union to be not just about what are called bread and butter issues, but about the wider social justice agenda that's happening in the city. There's these new levels of democracy that folks just are not used to in their union. Again, the woman who didn't even know the president of the union's name, and that woman in particular who I interviewed became very active, took an active leadership role among the union, general expansion of members being in control of the union and running things in the union. And one of the most important things that I think, and it became sort of central to what eventually became the strike, is that this is a union that actually put forward a vision of what education reform should look like. Unions in the past, teachers' unions in the past, are frequently characterized by these the neoliberal reformers as being sort of bodies that are blocking education reform. And maybe if teachers' unions spoke up about what neoliberal education reform looked like, they might say, this is bad, like we don't want this for our students, this is not beneficial to them, but they would not often wouldn't put forward their own vision for what that reform should look like. The Chicago Teachers Union under this new leadership really did that. They put out this document that became their sort of central document that explained their vision for how schools actually should look. That I think it laid out sort of in very stark terms like what the CPS system looked like and what it should look like. 91% of the students in Chicago public schools are students of color. Over 80% qualify for free or reduced lunches. Extreme poverty throughout the system. And it should be noted that Chicago is not 91% people of color, right? Chicago is something like 35–40% white. So all of those white students who live, school-age students who live in Chicago are being sent to public school, to private schools, because parents, for whatever reasons, the schools are in rough shape, or the parents are racist and don't want their children with students of color. Whatever reason, that 91% of the school is students of color. There's large amounts of trauma and exposure to violence. I don't know if anyone heard the This American Life episode that was a few weeks ago about this high school in Chicago, Harper High School, that really puts a lot of the issues of what Chicago public school students are dealing with on a daily basis, like extreme levels of violence and gang violence in the city. And so it's a really highly unequal and highly really rough system for CPS students. And in this document, the schools that Chicago's children deserve, which is something that I think folks here might be interested in checking out. They put forward this vision about school children in CPS being able to have arts and music classes. Right now, only 25% of CPS students or of CPS schools have arts and music teachers, which is mind-blowing to me as someone who I went to a kind of crappy public school in Michigan, but I always took it for granted I would have an arts and music teacher, right? Libraries for all schools, and there's 160 schools out of the 600-some in Chicago that don't have libraries. Again, something that most people, I think, who don't come up in these urban school districts take for granted that your school would have a library. What folks call wraparound services, that there are no, there's like 202 nurses throughout the entire Chicago public school system, when, according to independent analyses of both sort of nurse-to-student ratios, there should probably be sort of like 684 nurses in Chicago public schools, but instead there's a third of them. Right? Social workers, same story. So they put forward this vision of what education reform should look like. It's a longer document that goes into lots of details about all the different all kinds of different reforms that they think should be happening, which again is something that lots of teacher unions have not done and don't do. And that document became sort of the basis for this strike that they went on, which folks probably heard about in September. The strike became the means by which they were going to be fighting for that agenda of a kind of progressive education reform. And going on strike, they were fighting for the things that were in that document, that no one else, I should say, is talking about. That the people who are pushing this kind of neoliberal education reform are not talking about arts and music classes for every single CPS student, libraries. There's no plan to make those things happen. The teachers union was the one who made the habit, really fought for that through things like the strike. Probably going over time here, so I can wrap up. Because there's lots more to talk about with the strike, and there's this huge school closure fight in Chicago. But the central point that I guess I'm trying to make with this book I'm writing about the CTU and sort of in talking about them in general is that the teachers unions have been seen again as this sort of as preventing education reform from happening across the country in schools that are admittedly in really rough shape, like schools that are lacking these very, very basic resources that lots of other school districts really take for granted. And these education reformers, these neoliberal education reformers, would like to blame teachers unions for the sorry shape of these schools. But the Chicago Teachers Union has really shown that teachers unions can be a means by which teachers fight for those things for students. And so, in fighting for their students, they're also fighting back against this agenda that has really exacerbated inequality for public school students around the country. So I guess I can stop there. Things folks want to talk about. It's a very large topic. I skipped over large things I was going to talk about because I've gone over time. But anyone has any thoughts or yeah.
Can you talk a little bit about Karen Lewis and what was it about her personality that I guess allowed her to assume leadership of the union and reasons for her success? I mean, is there personal qualities about her that may be unique or maybe different?
So Karen Lewis is the president of the Teachers Union. Folks might have seen her on TV. She was I forget how long she was in the classroom, something like 22 years, maybe even 30 years as a chemistry teacher. And never had any real, the way she tells the story, which I believe, that she never had any aspirations to become the president of the union. Now, there was something she thought she would do. She was actually planning on retiring before she ran for president, but was convinced that she should. And the way that the fight in Chicago is often portrayed is sort of like Karen Lewis with this huge personality versus Rahm Emanuel, the mayor, with this also huge personality. This sort of like foul-mouthed mayor who doesn't take any crap, with this like equally sort of, well, not quite as foul-mouthed, but sort of fighting woman who's not going to take any crap from the mayor, right? And there's certainly some truth to that, and it's been interesting to see how people have really sort of, like whenever Karen speaks in public, people start chanting like Karen for mayor, which is funny to see. But I think the bigger reason for the CTU's success has been that they have actually, it's like a lot more of a boring thing actually. They've just transformed the union and made it much more democratic and made the members themselves take on much more power in the union. So that when you see media ask Karen Lewis, well, are you going to do X thing as a union? And she'll say, well, I have to take it to the members and talk to the members about whether or not that's something that they would want to do. This is not the way that unionism almost anywhere is done. Certainly in lots of teachers unions, but in any kind of union. There's this sort of person who's on top and sort of calls the shots and tries to get their members in line behind this thing that they want to do. So while Karen Lewis is a very fascinating public personality, I think the bigger reason that the CTU has become the sort of dynamic national force that it is because the union has really engaged with sort of grassroots, bottom-up